Nora was born the day her father's ship never returned, a child shaped by the ocean that took him and the silence that followed. Her mother, Claire, turned grief into control, keeping Nora anchored to the shore with guilt disguised as love. But when Nora's dreams pull her back toward the sea, she must choose between her mother's fear and her own freedom. Across stormy coastlines, lost letters, and long-buried secrets, two women collide, one trying to protect the past, the other trying to escape it. In the end, the same ocean that broke their family might be the only force strong enough to heal it. A haunting story of loss, love, and learning to let go. When my stepmother, Carol, told us she was dying, I didn't cry. I wish I could say it was because I'd matured or learned to hold my emotions like grown-ups do, but the truth was, I didn't believe her. The morning she made the announcement, she wore her usual silk robe, hair perfectly blown out, lipstick the same coral shade she'd worn for 20 years. She was sitting at the head of our mahogany breakfast table beside my father's untouched coffee, like a queen on her throne. "It's cancer," she said softly, eyes sweeping over us. "Stage 4. My little sister Maddie dropped her spoon. Milk splashed over the table. My father froze, his hand midair, as if grief had struck him like lightning. And me? I just stared at her manicured nails tapping the table and thought, here we go again. Carol had always been the center of every storm. When Dad married her, I was 13, a lanky, sarcastic kid who just lost her mother to pneumonia. Carol arrived like a movie star out of place in our quiet Maine town. Fur coat, heels sinking into the gravel driveway, perfume that smelled like gardenias and money. At first, I tried to like her, I really did. But she took over our house like it was a hostile acquisition, repainting the kitchen, throwing out my mom's worn-out recipe books, replacing the family photos with her own tasteful decor. Dad, too, changed under her orbit. He laughed less, spent more, and slowly became the kind of man who apologized for existing too loudly. By the time I turned 16, Carol had isolated him from most of his friends and had Maddie calling her mommy. I learned to stay out of her way. Quiet rebellion through distance. But this performance of mortality felt like her most dangerous act yet. The diagnosis came with tears, hospital visits, and a GoFundMe page that spread like wildfire through our small coastal community. Dad remortgaged the house to make her comfortable. She quit her part-time work at the local gallery, but somehow kept the spa appointments, the designer clothes, the vacations. I watched as our bank accounts shrank and her sympathy fund grew. I told myself not to interfere, not to play detective because my father was too fragile and Maddie was too young. Still, small details gnawed at me. The tan lines she brought back from treatment, the full head of hair she never lost, the medical bills that arrived in plain envelopes but never bore a hospital's name. And yet, every time I questioned anything, Dad's voice would break. "Don't start, Nora. She's sick." The breaking point came 3 months later when I visited Carol's oncologist office, a modern building off Route 1 that looked suspiciously like a day spa. The receptionist blinked when I said Carol's name. "We don't have anyone by that name here," she said, politely confused. I thanked her and walked out with my heart pounding, the Atlantic wind sharp against my face. That night, I sat outside on our porch, watching the sea churn under a gray sky, and decided I was done being the quiet one. I wasn't sure what my end game was yet, revenge, justice, or just the truth. But I knew one thing. Carol's story didn't add up, and I was going to find out why. The next morning, I began my quiet war. While Dad drove Carol to her chemo sessions, I combed through old mail, insurance statements, and bank notifications. Most were normal, but then I found a transaction. A payment to the Green Cove Inn in Vermont, dated the same week she'd been hospitalized for severe complications. I printed it along with a dozen similar charges. My hands shook, not from fear, but from clarity. For years, I'd watched this woman manipulate my father, drain his savings, and reshape our lives into her theater of control. Maybe now, fate was finally giving me an opening. Maybe I could finally reclaim my mother's house, my father's mind, and the truth that Carol thought she'd buried beneath her lies. I started small, the way you test the waters before you jump. 2 calls a day, 3 at most. Questions phrased like casual curiosity. "Hey, Dad, what hospital did Carol say she's going to this week?" I'd ask, voice easy. He'd sigh and say something like, "Somewhere in Portland. They rotate her appointments." When I pushed for specifics, he'd mutter about not wanting to upset her. So I stopped asking him and started asking everyone else. Neighbors, old coworkers, people who'd known us before Carol moved in. It amazed me how many people flinched when her name came up. They'd give me stories about dinners, charity events, trips, none of which lined up with someone whose life was supposedly measured in months. I took notes, dates, little contradictions. A spa appointment on the same day she claimed she could barely get out of bed. A gala she skipped because of fatigue, where she was photographed laughing with a bottle of champagne on Instagram. Each oddity felt like a pebble dropped into a glass of still water, creating rings that spread and widened until the surface was broken. The deeper I dug, the more carefully she'd hidden her tracks. Carol had a way of making paperwork disappear. Important bills arrived in unmarked envelopes, and statements were often addressed to her maiden name. Neat handwriting in a P.O. box in another state. It took me 2 weeks to find an old email address she'd used once. And when I sent a polite message posing as a neighbor, I got a reply that sounded rehearsed and brittle. She mentioned a clinic she'd been going to for holistic oncology and offered to forward me some reading material. I printed the pamphlets and read them until my eyes burned. Testimonials, testimonials, more testimonials. People healed by detoxifying protocols, stories about the body's innate power to heal, and very little clinical data. The language was vague by design. Without a hospital name, without an oncologist's signature, there was nothing concrete to grab onto. It would have been easy to walk away empty-handed, chalk it up to something I couldn't change, except for one thing: my father's bank account, which had been bleeding quietly for months. Confronting that reality was like watching a slow-motion robbery. I sat at my small kitchen table one night, laptop glowing in the dim light, and mapped out every outgoing charge from Dad's account for the last year. Spa treatments, boutique supplements, donations to a healing center, airline tickets to retreats upstate. All charged in Carol's name or one of her many aliases. I printed spreadsheets, circled suspicious entries in red, and highlighted patterns that painted a picture of someone siphoning money through emotional blackmail. It hurt to see my father's name attached to transactions for bed and breakfast when we were barely affording groceries. It hurt more because I knew he wasn't stupid. He was gentle and lonely and had been slowly convinced that leaving Carol would be cruelty. She had weaponized pity. She had built a private mythology where she was fragile and deserving, and he was the one to sacrifice for her. And in that mythology, any dissent was cruel, selfish, or cruelly insensitive. I tried reasoning first. I sat him down in the living room where the old couch sagged just the way it always had, and told him what I'd found. I showed him the spreadsheets, the receipts, the dates that made no sense. For a moment, he looked like the man I remembered, clear-eyed, ashamed, the years peeling off. He touched the edge of the paper as if it might burn him. I didn't want to know. I thought if I looked away, maybe it would go away, he said at last. It was the stupidest, most human thing I'd ever heard. it broke me in two. I wanted to shout, to throw the papers into the air and make him see, but instead, I sat there and planned. If he couldn't leave her on his own, I would pry him loose. If he clung to her for fear or pity, I would take fear and pity away by exposing the ledger of lies. I would be methodical because anger is messy and I needed solutions, not catharsis. So I built a case the way a nurse builds a treatment plan. Data first, then intervention. I contacted an old friend from the credit union where Dad still kept an account and quietly asked about overdraft protections, guardianship clauses, and how joint accounts could be frozen in cases of suspected fraud. I called a lawyer, not to file yet, but to ask what evidence would make a solid claim. Meanwhile, I kept the social investigation alive. I found the woman who used to share Carol's Pilates class, and her name popped up on social media under a different last name. She remembered trips and parties, and even sent me a photo from a summer barbecue where Carol crouched in a floral dress, smiling, no hint of illness in her face. Each scrap I collected tightened the noose, and with each tightening, I felt less like the bitter daughter and more like an engine revving toward the thing that finally might make my father see. But I also felt the ethical weight of turning private grief into public evidence. I didn't relish the thought of humiliating a woman in front of our family. I wanted the truth to free us, not to feed my own cruelty. That was the line I kept telling myself I wouldn't cross. The night I decided to push forward, our house was quiet. Dad had fallen asleep in his armchair, the TV murmuring old baseball games, and Carol was upstairs supposedly resting. I opened a new document on my laptop and wrote down the plan. First, get copies of any medical correspondence through formal requests, clinics, and insurers. Second, prepare a financial audit with the bank's help to show the misdirection of funds. Third, assemble corroborating witnesses, neighbors, former gallery colleagues, the receptionist who didn't recognize her name. It sounded clinical, but I wanted it clinical. Revenge had never been about theatrics for me. It was about repair. I would not gloat when the house of cards fell. I only wanted my father back and, if possible, to make amends to the years he'd given up for performative sickness. When I closed my laptop that night, the Atlantic wind had calmed and the moon poured a silver slice across the porch. For the first time since Grandma's funeral, I felt a small, dangerous thing begin to move inside of me. Possibility. The morning Carol's mask began to slip was almost beautiful. The air smelled of salt and pine, gulls screamed above the gray Atlantic, and my father was humming in the kitchen, frying eggs like a man trying to build normalcy out of ashes. Carol came down the stairs in her silk robe, pale as always, but I noticed something new. A faint shimmer of perfume, a peach-toned blush across her cheeks, and the faint outline of fresh manicure polish. Not the picture of someone enduring late-stage cancer. "Good morning," she crooned, sliding into her chair. "Big day today. My scans are this afternoon." Her voice was light, but I caught the flicker, the split-second hesitation before she said it. And then, the smallest mistake of all, she picked up a glass of orange juice. She wasn't supposed to. For months, she'd claimed her treatments made citrus unbearable. I watched her sip. She noticed, and for the first time, she looked afraid. That single moment was all I needed to confirm it. She was lying, and she knew I knew. After breakfast, I offered to drive her to her appointment. She declined with a smile too tight for her face. "You've got work, honey. I'll manage." "Work can wait," I said, grabbing my keys anyway. Her lips trembled, not from sickness, but from calculation. "Nora, I appreciate it, but you just get bored sitting in a waiting room." Dad, oblivious, chimed in from behind his newspaper. "Let her take you, sweetheart. You shouldn't be driving if you're weak." And that did it. Carol's eyes flashed with something sharp. She turned to me, voice smooth again. Fine, but just this once. We drove in silence. The road out of town twisted between bare trees and cliffs that dropped into the ocean, the kind of view that made people forget things. She kept one manicured hand on her lap, the other clutching a silk scarf that matched her robe. After 20 minutes, I realized she wasn't giving directions. The clinic she'd mentioned was supposed to be in Portland, but she told me to turn onto a side road leading inland, away from the hospitals, towards the forest. "Carol," I said finally, "where are we going?" She hesitated, her hand tightening on the scarf. "I told you, it's a private facility. They don't take new patients, special protocols." "Right," I said softly. "Is that why it's listed as a resort on Google Maps?" Her silence was enough. I pulled the car over, cutting the engine. The sea breeze swept through the cracked window, cold and cleansing. She stared straight ahead, eyes wide. Caught, but not broken. "What are you doing, Nora?" she whispered. "What you should have done months ago. Telling the truth." She didn't deny it, not immediately. Instead, she let out a slow, trembling laugh, the kind that creeps into your bones because it isn't humor, it's surrender. "You think you figured me out," she said, eyes glittering. "You don't know what it's like to be invisible, to be dismissed. I gave your father purpose again. I gave him something to protect." My throat burned. "You gave him a lie to protect." "And what was I supposed to do?" she snapped. "Watch him wither away? Watch him mourn a woman who's been dead for 15 years while he forgets I even exist? The only time he looked at me was when I was fragile, when I needed saving." Her confession came out like venom laced with desperation. She wasn't apologizing, she was rationalizing. Every word stripped away the layers of sympathy she'd built. "You could have been honest. You could have been human." "I was," she said, voice trembling now, "until I realized no one rewards honesty." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of waves crashing below filled the silence, steady and eternal. She sat there staring at the horizon, maybe searching for an escape that didn't exist anymore. I watched her, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger, I felt pity. Cold, quiet pity for a woman so terrified of being unseen that she'd rather fake her own death than face being ordinary. When we got back home, she went upstairs without a word. My father looked up from the couch, confusion wrinkling his brow. He asked how the scan was. Carol paused halfway up the stairs, turned slightly, and smiled. Clear, miraculously clear. Then she disappeared into the bedroom. Dad's face lit up, relief flooding him like light after a storm. "Oh, thank God," he breathed. "Maybe she's really turning a corner." I stared at him, this man who'd given everything to a lie, and I made my choice. That night, after he went to bed, I sat at the dining room table and opened my folder of evidence. Printouts, receipts, photos. The truth was all there, undeniable. But something inside me shifted. Maybe revenge wasn't about exposing her yet. Maybe the better punishment was to let her live with the dread of knowing I could. So I placed one sheet of paper, a single photo of her at the Vermont Inn, champagne in hand, on her vanity mirror. No notes, no message, just proof. The next morning, she didn't come down for breakfast, and from that day on, she stopped pretending to be sick. The morning after Nora left, the house felt hollow, like a seashell emptied of life. Waves crashed outside the window, echoing through the silence. Claire stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair where Nora had once sat with her coffee and half a smile. For years, Claire had lived in denial, convinced that holding Nora close would keep her safe from the same sea that took her husband. But now, as the wind howled across the dunes, she realized the truth. She hadn't protected her daughter. She had imprisoned her. Guilt hit her in waves. Each photograph on the mantle, Nora's first steps, her first science fair ribbon, her high school graduation, reminded Claire of all the time she'd said, "Stay close, don't go too far." Each warning had built the walls that drove her daughter away. Days passed without word from Nora, and Claire's restlessness grew unbearable. Finally, she packed a small duffel bag, locked up the house, and drove north toward Maine's rugged coast, the same coastline where her husband's ship had vanished 23 years earlier. The drive felt both terrifying and freeing. Every curve of the road whispered memories, laughter and stormy nights, the smell of salt on her husband's skin, the fear that followed. When she reached the harbor, she stopped by the same docks where she'd once stood with a toddler in her arms, waiting for a man who never returned. Now, she waited for her daughter instead. She went to the small research center Nora had joined, pretending it was just a visit. But when she saw Nora from afar, hair tied back, standing tall among the other researchers, something inside her broke open. Nora wasn't lost. She was becoming exactly who she was meant to be. When Nora spotted her mother at the pier, her expression was unreadable at first. Shock, confusion, and then a soft flicker of emotion. They hadn't spoken in weeks, and so much hung unspoken between them. Claire tried to find her words, but only managed, "You look just like your father." Nora's eyes shimmered with tears. For the first time, she didn't flinch at the comparison. "I think I understand him now," she said quietly. They walked along the edge of the dock, neither rushing the silence. Claire told her she had been wrong to keep her from the ocean, wrong to bury her grief by controlling her dreams. "I thought if I kept you close, I'd never lose you." She confessed. Nora looked out at the horizon, the same line her father had once chased. "You didn't lose me, Mom. You just didn't let me live." It wasn't said in anger, but in release. That evening, they stood together on the cliffs where the sea met the sky. The tide was high, the wind fierce, and the world felt vast again. Nora placed her father's compass, the one Claire had given her as a child, into her mother's hand. She always said, "This doesn't point north, it points home." Nora smiled faintly, realizing the compass had never been about direction, it had been about faith. The ocean wasn't their enemy, it was their story. The family's love had always been tied to it, both beautiful and brutal. For the first time, Claire didn't see the sea as something that stole. She saw it as something that gave. It gave her love, it gave her loss, and now it was giving her back her daughter. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in molten gold, Nora wrapped her arm around her mother's shoulder. Together, they watched the waves crash below, their rhythms syncing with their hearts. "Maybe I'll stay a while. Not to stop moving, just to breathe." Claire nodded, her eyes on the water. "And maybe I'll learn to let go, not to lose you, but to let you live." The wind carried their laughter out to sea, light, fragile, and infinite. The ocean no longer felt like a grave, it felt like a promise kept. And for the first time in decades, the two women stood side by side, not as a mother clinging to her past or a daughter running from it, but as two souls finally learning how to sail again.